I try to describe how from 1920 on, Freud completely changed this theory, and instead of the original concepts, two drives which contradicted each other, namely the sexual drive and the drive for self-preservation, he substituted for them two very different drives, namely that which he called the death instinct and the life instinct, or sometimes he called the life instinct also eros. I tried to explain last time that indeed the original concept until 1920 was essentially what I called a mechanistic concept. Here were the physiologically conditioned, and today one would say neurophysiologically given impulses which existed and were there, and what men would do would be to control them, but he couldn't control them too well. They would explode from time to time. And so you had this mechanistic concept, instinct versus control. And the question was always, how strong would the instinct be? How strong would the control be? Actually, the concept of sexuality in the first phase of Freud was that it was chemically determined, that it was a chemically determined sensitization through the stimulation of various erotogenic zones. Now that is a little hard, even reading it from my notes. I have to explain for those who are not entirely familiar with Freud's work that Freud assumed here that this sexuality is stimulated in various erotogenic or erogenous zones. The first one, the mouth, later the rectum, the anus, and later the genitals, male and female, and that by chemical processes within the body, these zones are sensitized and lead to what you might call an appetite or a desire, which, if not fulfilled, creates tension. That was the older concept of sexuality in Freud. And as I think I indicated last time, or maybe I didn't, you could actually construct the model of a robot, or to be more scientific, of a computer, in which all these events would occur just as in men. You could create, and that is to say, you could program, at least I assume, although I'm not a specialist in the field of electronics and computers. In fact, not only not a specialist, I know very little about it. But from the little I read and from some people whom I have talked about, I understand you could construct a computer, or as a science fiction literature says, a robot, in which you would have this regulation of tension. Once it rises up to a certain point, then release of tension by satisfaction of certain instincts, which eventually are bound to erogenous or erogenous zones, and which normally eventually are dominated and unified in what one calls the genitals, or what Freud calls genital sexuality. Now, in this concept, and I said this perhaps also last time, you find that the relationship to the other person is entirely secondary. What the machine needs is reducing the tension once the tension has risen. And in a peculiar way, a man at least normally, needs a woman, or the woman a man, to satisfy or to equalize the tension, to satisfy the wish. And really, the basic concept which Freud has here is that of the man, the modern man on the market. I don't mean necessarily the old-fashioned market, it's also the new market. You go because you need to buy something. You enter in relationship with the person who has to sell. So both profit. You get what you want, he gets what he wants, but nobody ever said that the relationship between the buyer and the seller is one of love. It is a relationship which is principle, an egotistical relationship, a completely egocentric relationship in which each other uses one as means, in which there is nothing primary in terms of relatedness or in terms of love, which is related to sexuality. Now, in the new theory, as I also began to indicate, you find an entirely different concept, not anymore the mechanistic concept of chemically determined, localized needs, but you find the concept of two biological forces, that of the tendency for death, of return to anorganic pre-life conditions in which there is no life at all, and on the other hand, the other pole is what Freud called the life instinct, a tendency to integrate, to preserve living substance, and to join it into ever larger units. I want to call your attention here to a peculiarity in terminology which will occupy us in a few minutes, and that is that Freud stuck here to his terminology death instinct and life instinct. He kept the word instinct for something which, as I shall try to show in a minute, is not an instinct in terms of his previous concepts. But if you take the word eros, there the word instinct is missing. He did not speak of an erotic instinct or an eros instinct. So here is terminologically the first basic change from instinct to something else. But as I want to show you that Freud came, I want to give you one concrete statement of Freud, how suddenly his concept of love changed. I said last time, Freud really in this second phase began to discover love, because love was not anymore a side effect of sexual desire, sometimes perhaps a desirable one and sometimes an undesirable one, but at any rate love began to be something entirely of its own, namely this tendency to integrate, to grow. In fact, love became identical with life. And the force of love in this second concept of Freud became identical with the life force. All life, all integration is love, but is not the byproduct of the sexual instinct. And I want to quote you here something from a famous letter which Freud wrote to Professor Einstein in 1900, and I think it was 1933. The United Nations, at that time it was called the League of Nations, had asked that Einstein directed a question to Freud, why war? That is to say, what are the causes of war? And so Einstein asked Freud to write him what, in his opinion, are the causes of war. And Freud gave an answer which to a large extent was the argument dealt with the question of the death instinct and of the aggressivity which followed from the death instinct. Because, as I said last time, Freud assumed that the death instinct was either capable of being turned outside as destructiveness against others or inside as destructiveness against oneself. And so Freud made quite a point in his answer of saying to what extent war is really a necessity which follows from this peculiar dilemma in which man finds himself. But he writes something else too. Namely, he writes, anything that encourages the growth of emotional ties between men must operate against war. These ties may be of two kinds. In the first place, they may be relations resembling those toward a love object. Now you notice perhaps the cautious formulation, relations resembling to those toward a loved object, excuse me, this is very different, of a loved object. Though without having a sexual aim. This is new, because, well, I won't go into that, but I want to continue this sentence. There is no need for psychoanalysis to be ashamed to speak of love in this connection, for religion itself uses the same words, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, this is indeed a most curious statement of Freud. To say psychoanalysis need not be ashamed to speak of love, and to say that this is legitimate precisely because religion talks also of love. This is the same Freud who only 3 years earlier had ended in civilization's discontent, had ended a long discussion on the biblical command of thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself by saying, what is the point of a precept enunciated with so much solemnity if its fulfillment cannot be recommended as reasonable? Now, you could not have a more ironical statement about love of neighbor than saying that its fulfillment cannot be recommended as reasonable, and 3 years later the statement that indeed love is that which can counteract hate, and it's legitimate precisely because religion recommends it. This is a drastic change in Freud, in his attitude toward commands like love, and yet is a change which, strangely enough, and I shall try to show you that, remains also marginal. It was not followed up. And this brings me to the essential point of what I'm trying to show now, namely how Freud tried to, I can only say, and I said it last time, to repress the awareness that the mechanistic theory and the new theory were just irreconcilable, that they were completely contradictory. And I shall try a little bit further than last time to show you what went on in Freud's mind and how he tried desperately to find a solution and did not find one. Incidentally, somebody asked me last time where one can read about this change. Well, you can read about it from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the Ego and the Id, especially the introductory new lectures into psychoanalysis, to his last works written just shortly before his death, Outline of Psychoanalysis and Analysis, Terminable and Interminable, and this letter to Einstein, Why War? But you will be, I'm afraid, a little bit disappointed if you expect that you will read it just as simply as I'm trying to present it here. I'm trying to give the results of an analysis of this development, which in this way, for reasons which I shall show now, is presented not that explicitly, not that clearly, and especially with many contradictory ways in Freud's own writings. Now, let us begin with a statement that his death instinct is not an instinct in terms of his own definition, his earlier definition. I quote here one of the most reliable witnesses for Freudian theory, a very well-known psychoanalyst who unfortunately died a number of years ago, Dr. Fenichel, who wrote the following and who attacked the theory of the death instinct. And he wrote the following: for according to the definition, instinct aims at eliminating the somatic change which we designate as a source of the instinct. But the death instinct does not aim at eliminating dissimulation. For this reason, it does not seem to me possible to set up the death instinct as one species of instinct over against another species. Well, it may be a little bit too technical if I went into this whole question, but I could not have a more, how should I say, orthodox witness from the Freudian camp than Fenichel for this statement that the death instinct does not correspond to what Freud had originally meant by instinct. But it is not only that the death instinct is not an instinct in Freud's original sense, but the life instinct, or eros, is also not an instinct. For several reasons. One, it is not a chemically determined sensitization through the stimulation of various erotogenic zones. It has no specific physiological source, and it is not an instinct for a third reason, which will occupy us for a little while now, and this will really the last difficult mountain which we'll have to cross. From then on, things will be a little simpler. It is not an instinct for the reason that late in his life, Freud, and there are indications of that earlier already, Freud defined the nature of an instinct as being conservative. By that he didn't mean anything political, but he meant conservative, that it tried to return to something, to restate a former state of being. And in this sense, the love eros is not conservative. Or maybe it is. Well, I shall talk about this and about one of the peculiar phenomena in Freud's thinking. Let me say first that sometimes that Freud was wavering for sometimes. For instance, in the new introductory lectures, he says at one point, our hypothesis is that there are two essentially different classes of instinct, the sexual instinct understood in the widest sense, eros, if you prefer that name, and the aggressive instinct whose aim is destruction. Now here you see, he calls the sexual instinct understood in the widest sense as eros, if you prefer that name. This is a very peculiar way of expressing oneself. Perhaps you think of the fact that in his previous work, in his earlier work, Freud had understood the sexual instinct also in the widest sense, but in a very different way. Namely, he had meant by the sexual instinct not only what we call sexuality, which he would call genital sexuality, but the oral and anal libido, or whatever the word would be, instinct component, while here he speaks of the sexual instinct and eros as being identical, although, if you prefer that name, you can call it eros. I don't know whether I can make it clear to you that a thinker like Freud, who was so very clear in his writing, so very precise, how the intellectual embarrassment is shown here, in which he has to express himself with all this hedging about words when he tries to say they are the same, and yet he does not, he phrases it in a peculiar way by saying these things like, if you prefer that name, etc. Freud makes a number of attempts later on to prove that eros, or the life instinct, has really the conservative nature which he demands from an instinct. But he does not succeed in really showing that or proving it. But I should like to make you acquainted with the most important attempt Freud made to show this, because that is also the most interesting point in the development of this new idea. And I have to read you something, because otherwise it might not become as clear as it is in his own words. He writes, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that is to say relatively early, he quotes Plato's report in the Symposium that famous legend or famous myth or idea or God knows reality, which Plato mentions there, and that is that men and women were originally united and formed one being, that then Zeus divided them in two halves, and that after this division each part was desiring his other part, and they came together and threw their arms about one another, eager to grow into one. This is the beautiful myth of Plato for what eros is, that the men and women originally were one, that they are divided, and from then on they want to be one again, and this is what love is. You can see, of course, this is an entirely different concept, this Platonic concept of eros, from the sexual concept of the earlier Freud, because there the primary point is not that these male and female come together because they can't stand the tension, but they get together because there is a primary wish to be one, because this polarity is solved only by being united with each other. And then Freud continues, shall we follow, and incidentally he quotes there also a very similar myth in one of the Upanishads, which is rather identical with Plato's myth. And then he says, shall we follow the hint given us by the poet-philosopher, meaning Plato, and venture upon the hypothesis that living substance at the time of its coming to life was torn apart into small particles, which have ever since endeavored to reunite through the sexual instincts? Now, I should like you to listen carefully to this, namely that Freud quotes Plato here as saying that living substance was divided. Plato really does not talk about living substance, although one can call it that way. Plato talks about male and female, about the fundamental and the most fundamental polarity which exists in all life, that between the male and the female pole. Freud does not speak about male and female here, but about living substance, as if this were a purely biological phenomenon which has nothing to do with male or female. Well, I continue. That these instincts in which the chemical affinity of inanimate matter persisted, gradually succeeded as it developed through the kingdom of the protista in overcoming the difficulties put in the way of that endeavor, and so on and so on. This is all then rather technical. But here I think he closes the paragraph, the moment has come for breaking off. So he does not say yes, he does not say no. He says there is an interesting speculation in Plato's myth. But he translates the speculation in terms of living substance being torn apart. However, later on, in his latest writing in the Outline of Psychoanalysis, he has left this possibility as an open possibility. And he states, well, I'm sorry, I lost, this page got somewhere lost here, but it doesn't really matter too much. Here it is, in fact. He states the following. In the case of eros and the love instinct, we cannot apply this formula, namely of the conservative character of the instance. To do so would presuppose that living substance was once a unity, which had later been torn apart and was now striving towards reunion. So he flatly comes to the conclusion this is not possible to accept this as a solution, as an answer for the conservative nature of instincts. And here comes our great question. Why did Freud not accept the one theoretical way out for his great difficulty? Because if he had taken Plato's myth in its original meaning, he would have come to the conclusion that exactly the life instinct obeys to the general condition of restituting an earlier condition, the earlier condition being the unification of male and female. They have been separated, and after that they want to reunite again, and therefore eros would obey precisely the law which he requires, namely that the drive is an attempt to return to an earlier condition. What I'm talking about now is not whether this is a correct theory or not. What I'm talking about is the amazing fact that Freud did not seize upon this simple and obvious solution of a problem which he was battling for many years. How he could fit the requirement of the conservative nature of instinct with a specific notion of the life instinct or eros. One might say there is nothing simpler precisely than to draw the conclusion, yes, that is a nature of eros, to go back to the original unity between male and female. Now, why did he not do that? In the first place, you might say he blocks his way by insisting on the formulation living substance is torn apart, and then speculate why living substance, why that could not be. But that only puts the question a little bit further back. Why does he not talk? Why does he emphasize the living substance instead of emphasizing male-female? And I think the answer to this is very simple. Here you find one of the emotional or affective prejudices of Freud. Freud is a typical representative of the patriarchal world, of patriarchal thinking, especially of the 19th century. Freud did not accept the notion that male and female were equal. He said very explicitly that the libido, that is to say sexuality, was masculine. The woman sexually was a mutilated man and suffered her whole life from the sadness about her mutilation, which could only be made up by some other symbolic or God knows what substitutions. Freud did not have the concept. It was impossible for him to think of the human race as being governed principally and basically by the tension, by the polarity of male and female, which is a basic polarity of all living substance. Because to have this concept would have been possible for him only if he had seen men and women as equal. And since for him the essence was always sexuality, and since he assumed in a typical male blindness that only the man having a penis had a sexuality and the woman was just on the receiving end, he could not imagine that there could be a polarity, and therefore he could not imagine or formulate that the whole problem of love and of eros was, between the sexes, that the divided two halves wanted to come together again. It is, in the history of theory formation, you might say almost tragic to see how a man, a genius like Freud, came close to a very important breakthrough of his theory, in which eros, rather than sexuality in the mechanistic sense, would be the center of his theoretical system, and how he missed it because he could not think in categories of polarity between male and female. And so he missed, of course, something else, which is a very important phenomenon, and that is that this polarity between male and female is really the basis for all relations between men and women, and that there are really only three possible outcomes, basically two. One is, if there is union between the polarity, that is to say, if there is eros, there is love. But if the two poles cannot unite, or to speak in Platonic terms, if the one half cannot find his other half, then the two poles cannot stand each other. They have to weaken or to destroy the other pole. There is no other alternative in this polarity but the one between union or war or fight. This is indeed the dynamism of the relationship between the sexes. And if you go through history, then indeed I think you find that history has the most beautiful examples of the positive solution of this dynamism in all the phenomena of love, but that to a large extent history is a war between the sexes, in which man uses his weapons, mainly that of power, physical and economic and political, and women uses their weapon, which I think is essentially ridicule, towards which men are very sensitive, and women know it better than men do. And you find in the process of the interchange between men and women all kind of mixtures, of course, between a partial union, a partial war, complete union, complete war. And indeed, this is a study which would have led to which Freud would have stimulated had he been able to overcome his patriarchal prejudice, that is, that there could be no polarity. The very man who in everything saw dichotomies, polarities, opposing forces, in the most central issue of human relations could not see opposing forces and became a monist. Speaks only of one pole, and that is sexuality per se, and that pole is simply a product of chemical reactions and has nothing to do with male and female. So one would have to say that if Freud has been criticized for overestimating sexuality, well, that is perhaps, in a way, a criticism. But this criticism makes only sense if one adds one which is much more serious, namely to criticize Freud for having underestimated eros. Freud did not give to love, to eros, in the narrow sense of the word of the love between men and women, and in the wider sense of the word of the love of both men and women for the world, for all that which is in front of them. Freud did not give this eros its place, in spite of the fact that at one point he came so close to this that he called the fundamental drive of man, at least one fundamental motivation, he called eros. But at this point he was blocked for the reasons I tried to explain. I have gone into so much detail in trying to give you at least an outline of this development of Freud's theory for two reasons. Partly because it is really important if one wants to understand the development of Freud's concept. And I can assure you it is really very complicated and difficult because it is so contradictory. It is so contradictory not because he means to be ambiguous, as some of the political statements we are made today are meant to be ambiguous, but he really is caught in a conflict. I have mentioned it at such detail, not only for the reason that it's important in order to understand Freud's theory, but also as an example for something very important which you find not only in Freud, but in many of the greatest thinkers in the world, of great geniuses, namely that they are prevented by certain prejudices, which can be cultural thought habits, cultural patterns, or which can be, like here, culturally conditioned affects, like the patriarchal complex, that by these prejudices, they are prevented from arriving at the completion of their vision, which in this case would have been to establish eros instead of sexuality as the primary driving force of life. And that their pupils, who are even less advanced, why do I say even, who are less advanced, and that is a mild statement, cling, of course, much more to the thought habits, much more to the affective prejudices. They tend to be much more faithful to that which is a cliché and which does not disturb their thought habits. And in that sense, the great thinker becomes not only the prisoner of his own system of thought, of his own affects, but he becomes a prisoner also of his pupils, especially if he founds a big organization like Freud did, in which the whole thinking becomes controlled and by a close circle of students who set themselves up as the guardians of orthodox thought. In a way, one cannot help being reminded here of the figure of Moses, with whom Freud identified himself so much and so consciously, who went almost to the Holy Land, but he had to stop before he ever went there, before he ever came there. And you may say that of Freud too. He came almost to a completely new theory which overcame the mechanistic old theory, but he was stopped by his own past from transcending his past, and he could never see the land he was going to and he was leading to. Now, you might also say, generally speaking, that we can analyze a scientific theory, perhaps not in the natural sciences. I'm not sufficiently familiar to have any judgment about that. But certainly in the social sciences, including psychology, we can analyze it in the very strict sense of analysis which Freud had created, by observing contradictions, unnecessary fallacies. By unnecessary fallacies, those fallacies which a person, according to his talent and intelligence, would not have needed to make, and then by finding out the sources for these fallacies and for the peculiar way in which the theory developed in certain affective complexes. The author has not to be on the couch. All that it needs is to read very carefully what the author is saying, not to omit anything, not to put anything aside, and to follow him very exactly in his own thinking, in his own contradictions, and to analyze what is the reason why this man could not arrive at the conclusion which he otherwise would have arrived at. I want to say a few words now about the death instinct. Freud, in the concept of the death instinct, came to a tragic alternative, namely that the alternative for man was either to destroy others or to destroy oneself. I shall talk later how he thought this conflict could be mitigated, but that was basically the tragic conflict to which he arrived. I'm trying to read you here one statement that is in the new introductory lectures, where he says, "And now we are struck by the significance of the possibility that the aggressiveness may not be able to find satisfaction in the external world because it comes against real obstacles." Well, real obstacles, there are many real obstacles to aggressiveness, for instance, police and machine guns, etc. If this happens, it will perhaps retreat and increase the amount of self-destructiveness holding sway in the interior. We shall hear how this is in fact what occurs and how important a process this is. Impeded aggressiveness seems to involve a grave injury. It really seems as though it is necessary for us to destroy some other thing or person in order not to destroy ourselves, in order to guard against the impulsion to self-destruction. A sad disclosure indeed for the moralist. Well, I would say not only for the moralist, a sad disclosure for every human being, that he comes into this world and has only the choice between destroying others or destroying himself. Or he says in his last work in the Outline of Psychoanalysis, holding back aggressiveness is in general unhealthy and leads to illness. This is a very simple formulation, and again we deal with the same tragic conflict. He assumed that culture was a result of sublimation or repression of sexuality, including also pregenital sexuality, and that if man wanted culture, he had to repress his instincts. And if he wanted complete happiness, he had to renounce culture. Now, Freud very definitely was on the side of culture. He was the last man to recommend the primacy of the sexual satisfaction. He was really rather prudish and a typical Victorian in all these matters. Of course, this conflict is not so tragic, or is not as tragic as it sounds, because really it is not a matter anyone would choose or could choose to go back to the caves and to choose a way of the complete and uninhibited satisfaction of all genital and pre-genital impulses. And of course, it's also a question that whether that really does inhibit the development of culture or not. This is an assumption of Freud's. But I should like to make one footnote here, and that is the basic misunderstanding of an author like Marcuse, who believes to defend the Freudian viewpoint by saying the important social and political progress lies in freeing men from sexuality. A point of view which actually was made earlier by a very gifted psychoanalyst, Wilhelm Reich. In other words, that the repression of sexuality and of, according to Marcuse, pre-genital sexuality, or what commonly is often called perversions, that this repression really is an infringement of human freedom, and that human freedom is achieved by the full satisfaction of these sexual demands. Well, I would say two things can be said about it. In the first place, this is not Freudian. This is not at all the concept of Freud. Marcuse thinks that in arguing for this, he argues against capitalism in favor of a future, let us say, socialism or humanism, whatever it may be. Well, Freud made it very clear that he is convinced that any civilization, whatever it would be, capitalist, socialist, or God knows what, would necessarily be one of sexual repression. So Marcuse's view is a misinterpretation or implied misinterpretation of Freud. And I think it's also wrong because it is really an old-fashioned model of thinking, for which also Wilhelm Reich fell, or for which he fell, namely the idea that the repression of sexuality is a conservative concept, and that the uninhibited sexuality is a revolutionary and progressive concept. Well, I guess we would live in a very revolutionary and progressive world if we would measure it by the sexual revolution in its progress. Indeed, sexuality has become rather free. It has become, in fact, one of the cheapest and most available commodities in a consumer's culture, practiced without much feeling, and increasingly so with a great deal of inner boredom and dissatisfaction. And it is simply sticking to older concept, to think of the old conservatives who were against sex or for great controls of sex, and then putting up a contrast that the progressives or radicals or revolutionaries are for sex. Well, this is really proven as being wrong already since 1933, because the Nazis showed that they were by no means conservative about sexual matters. The conservative nationalists were, but the Nazis were not at all. This is really both not, this concept of Marcuse is both not Freudian, nor is it really one which is very realistic in terms of what has gone on in the last 50 years in the Western world. Well, the time is already up, and in the next lecture, I shall use the first part to explain to you something which is a good deal easier than what I explained in these first two lectures, namely how Freud tried to mitigate the harshness of his tragic alternative. Freud was a very human man. He was, if not a pacifist, but a man who had a deep sense of conscience and of compassion with men. He was not a thinker like Professor Lawrence, who once had supported with scientific arguments the racial laws in Nuremberg. Freud had always been a man who had stood for the freedom of man and for man's happiness. For Freud to arrive at this alternative after the First World War, and for Freud to have to answer to Einstein, who was a more radical pacifist, in the years when the New World War, the Second World War, was already coming closer and foreseen by many people, not by many, but by some people. For Freud himself, this was a tragic choice. To stick to his theory, and he tried to mitigate it as much as he could. And as I said, next time I shall describe to you some of the ways in which he tried to mitigate it. Now, I have to ask your forgiveness for the fact that I shall not be able, as I had planned, to talk about Lawrence's book. This may be a disappointment to some of you because you, I'm afraid many more of you have read Lawrence and who have read Freud. But that is in inverse ratio to the value of the work of Lawrence and of Freud. Lawrence's work is essentially superficial, is based on superficial analogies between animals and men, and especially on a very questionable analogy between fishes and birds and men, which completely neglecting the problem that the very things which you observe in fish and birds are not to be observed in the primates, and there we have a genetic problem which is too complicated to go into. How then one would really explain that certain behavior patterns which are to be found in the gray-like geese, for instance, are to be found, are analogies for the behavior of the government of the United States and of the Soviet Union. And this is essentially the method which Lawrence follows. I thought it is preferable and more valuable to you if I try to give a more precise and detailed analysis of Freud as a work which will be remembered if books will still be read in 500 years from now, or if there's a mankind which will live, while I'm sure the book by Lawrence by then will not be even a footnote to anything. So you will forgive me for this change, and then next time I shall talk about the mitigating circumstances and about the critique of the whole concept of Freud's death instinct from my own standpoint, and then begin to talk about, that will be for the rest of the lectures, the various kinds of aggression which exist, because I believe that it is a mistake to assume that there is any such thing as aggressiveness. They are very different phenomena which may overlap sometimes, but which are essentially different and therefore have different causes and pose different psychological problems. So we have now a short intermission, and then we have some questions. Thank you. Yes, I have quite a number of questions, and I regret that I cannot answer all of them, in fact, not most of them. So I do as best as I can. Here's one question in the context of human aggression. Is there any value in studying the other primates? Indeed, there is. I shall speak in the next lecture, next time, about aggression among the primates. I have to be very brief about it, but nevertheless, I shall try to present the main results which follow from a study of primates' aggressiveness. I have here a question which I do not read because it is formulated in a way which might sound to some people funny, although it is a very serious thing. And strangely enough, I have had it in the past. And it's a very serious problem for anyone who talks theoretically, as I did today, about the war between the sexes and about the alternative between love and war, or even the wish to destroy. I said already today there are, and I hope everybody has heard that I do not mean to say there is just the alternative, either complete love or complete war. That there are many forms, intermediate forms in which union and antagonism are mixed. But I find from time to time, in speaking about these subjects, that questions come up in which, in fact, usually a man gives expression to the feeling that he just discovers that his wife is going to destroy him, that his wife not is going, that his wife is destroying him. Now, I do not deny that this sometimes is the case. But I am afraid that sometimes in this war, what I'm saying here theoretically might be used as a rationalization for accusations and might serve as fuel for the aggression of the very man who thinks he is being destroyed. I have not the slightest idea about the person who asked this question. I cannot say what is what. I cannot say he is right or he is wrong. I can only warn not to translate such concepts in interpretations of reality without being terribly careful. We know from political life well enough, and we might have to pay for it very dearly, that we tend to make up rationalizations of hostility and threats by others in order to rationalize our own attacks. This is a reason which has led to many wars, and this is equally dangerous in human relationships, in personal relationships. And therefore, one must very clearly differentiate between a theoretical picture, which necessarily has to be in the first place, slightly oversimplified, but even if it's not oversimplified, which puts things in a somewhat abstract way in order to indicate certain lines and not to rush to conclusions from that, which may very well be in line with one's preconceived ideas about being destroyed. Whenever anyone feels he is being destroyed, he may be right, but there is a very great chance that he better asks himself what is the basis for this idea, and that he is very careful. Here's a question: to what extent, what about societies in which women are dominant and have power? Do men then assume the ridiculing role? Your power ridicule model doesn't seem to hold up, in fact, in terms of power male and ridicule female. Well, we really don't know what goes on in societies in which women hold power. In our own society, it is often said that women control more money than men in the United States, but that is another matter from real power. well, we live in a watered-down patriarchal society, and I'm afraid one could say, and that is really the third solution, with a great amount of neutralization of the two sexes, in which only the anatomically and physiologically most necessary minimum remains a sexual differentiation. But I should like to mention that there was a great writer, Bachofen, who has discovered and written extensively about matriarchal societies which existed before the patriarchal time. Now, if I quoted Bachofen in the past, and I often have quoted him because I admire his writings very much, I was in the difficult position that there was no English translation. There is one now of Bachofen's work published by the Pantheon Press. It's not even terribly expensive, although it's not in a paperback. But so anyone who is interested in the problem of how does a society look in which women have power, then he or she better reads Bachofen's work, and he or she will not only get a very interesting theory about this question, but one of the most profound theories about human history. Here's a question: what other ways did Freud identify himself with Moses? I wrote about, in many ways, I wrote about this quite extensively in a book which I'm pretty sure is also published as a paperback, Sigmund Freud's Mission. I'm sure it is published as a paperback. And I try to show there the importance of the identification of Freud with two figures, with Moses and with Hannibal, the Carthaginian war leader. So if you're interested, you better read it, because I wouldn't have the time now to put the material together. The biblical view holds that woman was created from Adam's rib. Wouldn't Freud's concept, the non-polarity of man, woman, resemble this biblical concept? Indeed, it would. The Old Testament is a song of triumph, of male victory over matriarchal society. Just as Greek Olympian religion is the same, there Athene is born out of the head of Zeus, reversing the normal relationship as a man is born from a woman. If you read the older story of creation, the Babylonian story of creation, there you see that the world begins with a great mother and not with a great father, that the sons kill the mother, that by the power of their word and not by the natural power of bearing children. And the Old Testament begins precisely where the Babylonian myth ends. I have written about this in some detail in a book, The Forgotten Language, which is also in the paperback. Here's a question: to what extent did Freud's homosexuality prevent his thinking in terms of polarity and equality of men and women? I must say this is a completely new idea to me, and I don't think there is the slightest evidence for Freud's homosexuality, either conscious or unconscious or in any other way. That Freud was not what one popularly called a highly sexed man, with a great sexual interest in women. That's something else. But for heaven's sake, don't conclude from that a man has homosexual tendencies, because the sexual aspect of women is not that important to him. There are many very good people for whom that is so, and who would be, in fact, much happier if the social pattern didn't force them to show that much sexual interest. But it means by no means that, in women, I mean, it means not at all that they have homosexual impulses. Here's a question: does not aggressive acts in which one wins over another lead to eros or satisfaction? No, it doesn't. It just doesn't. it leads to satisfaction. So does torturing somebody leads to satisfaction for a sadist, but it doesn't lead to love or to eros. Well, I want to mention briefly one very thought to comment which I got, and mention only one point of this comment, which says that, in fact, not only Freud was prejudiced in his perception of women, but women actually performed like inferior beings. Freud was describing the reality around him. And it's perfectly true. And this is the vicious circle which you find so often, that given a cultural pattern, one side sees, and usually the dominant side has a certain picture of the control side. And the control side performs according to the expectation of the controlling side. And if they stop to perform that way, then indeed the controlling side not only becomes very upset, but often takes very drastic and dangerous measures to redress the situation and to get to a point where the control side performs according to the pattern the controlling side wants. That has held true for the relationship between men and women. It holds true for the relationship between races when one race is dominant over the other. It holds true in general for the relationship of dominant groups over groups which they control. Thank you.